Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about engineers and why web developers are not engineers. So let's get into it. So the question in question here is, Fredrik, why don't some programmers consider web developers to be engineers? Why is that so? And I think this is a fair question, I really do. And it touches on something that I am really against, and I think is like, if you do this sort of thing, in my world, you're either a politician or a salesperson or what we call a blah blah person. It's relabeling stuff or rebranding things with different new. That's a trend we have today. I suppose it's always been this way. I don't know why people have this urge to. I suppose it has to do with the perceived. Some type of perception regarding things. I mean, I remember so clearly that I spoke to a cleaner that used to work at my old company, and we were talking, and she has her own firm, and she runs it and all that stuff. And she explained that her job title was senior sanitation consultant. Yeah. I mean, that's a fancier title. I'm just a programmer, but she's a senior sanitation consultant. I mean, just blew my mind that, because in my world she was a cleaner, but that was apparently not correct. Just as I used to work when I was 19, I used to work in a little shop or like a supermarket, and I wasn't a store clerk. I was a sales representative. My friends who actually work in retailing and actually are proper, they have sales educations and like really they have done the work, kind of thought that was funny. And I think the same thing is true for engineering. Guys, technically the way it works is that if you have a degree, if you have an official education that makes you an engineer. I don't know if it's different in your region, but here in my region, that is something that you educate yourself to. It's something that you earn. Being an engineer is a specific profession. It's something that you go through school and quite a lot of, you go through quite a rigorous education to become an engineer. And I think that it's fair to stop, like I think that we should stop this. I mean, I've talked to people who call themselves QA engineers, testing engineer. I mean, it's just weird. Like you just muddy down the word until it doesn't mean anything. Today is basically engineers in IT muddied down to such a point where it really only means that you're kind of smart or you kind of know technical things at this point. And I think that's sad because I get where it's coming from, because you kind of hijack somebody else's term in order to give credibility to yourself, and all it does is that, as I said, it muddies down the meaning until it doesn't mean anything, and it happens with quite a lot of different words. And the reason why some people don't consider the web developers to be engineers is. It's hard to say for each individual who will claim this, but there are a few perspectives that I see that are fairly common. I mean, one part is, as I said, unless you actually are an engineer, unless you have gone through an engineering education, then you're technically not an engineer. You can call yourself one, but you don't have the degree. It's like a person who knows medicine who doesn't have a doctor's degree. If you don't have the license or like a testament that you actually know this stuff, then by quite a lot of people's definition, you're not really that sort of person, right? You can call yourself, of course, but that's you, right? But apart from that, a lot of so-called software engineers consider application level development, or like not necessarily desktop development, but that level of programming, or at the very least systems levels programming, as pretty much the real deal. That's software development. That's the real development that software developer does. And web development is a subgroup of this, or it's the same thing with mobile development. Technically, it's also a subgroup of this sort of application development. Now, the thing that I don't really agree on here is that I will admit, some of the people who make this claim, because I've heard this so many times, they do actually just want to. It's kind of like a grammar Nazi or something like that. They just want to direct you, like you are misusing a term or a definition that they know of, and now they want to direct you to the correct thing. and that's the whole story. But quite a lot of people they don't have that perspective. It's rather a matter of prestige, if you will. And this comes back to like this classical problem where, oh, somebody's using a term that I feel associated with. Now it's very important for me to really make sure that they fulfill my mental qualifications to be allowed to use that term. It's very important to me, because if I don't force them to abide by these rules, then I will be associated with these people, or they haven't, and it can be stuff like, these people aren't as good as me, they haven't earned the right to call themselves this, why the hell shouldn't I say something? I should tell them that, no, you're not really, I don't know, a police officer, you're not really a fireman, you're not really a programmer, you're not really this or that, because you haven't gone through this rigorous testing process that I myself went through. So you're not as good as I am, because that is basically what it boils down to. I perceive myself, or I perceive the group, that you're not allowed to call yourself to be higher value than what you are, and therefore I need to make it very clear to you that you're not really a whatever it is, right? And that comes down to quite a lot of complicated things, and that's going to be an entire video just to explain, or at least my perspective of why this usually happens. But what is interesting is that the person who wrote to me also mentioned that some people consider that the people who, say, consume something like React don't really, they're not really engineers, but the people who create React are actual engineers. And that also touches on something that I think is interesting. Okay, so now we're picking and choosing what within web development makes you an engineer and what doesn't make you an engineer. And so you can see here that there's no real logic or reason here. There's like elements of patterns to why people have this behavior. But from my perspective, the thing that's basically people are trying to express here is that an engineer solves problems. And the perception seems to be, and I have to agree to a point, because there is a grain of truth to this. The perception is that there's quite a lot of web developers these days that they don't actually know how to solve problems, to be problem solvers, or how to embrace this thing that is core to an engineer, which is to solve problems. They really only consume other people's tools. And they don't really know. I've said this before. I mean, if you only know how to use Bootstrap, are you really going to call yourself a web designer? You don't know CSS. You just know Bootstrap, and that's the thing that we try to. That I think that this is like the part that has some relevancy with this mindset that you're not really an engineer, because I mean, it's like being a WordPress developer does not make you an engineer. It's nothing wrong with it. It's more about how complicated are the problems, and how do you think about problem solving? How do you approach this sort of thing, right? So the best way I can describe it is that an engineer is the sort of person who can solve the problem that they have without necessarily having some other party provide them with an off-the-shelf solution how to solve that problem. So where a person who just writes some code would get stuck and just not know what to do, an engineer will actually sit down and go even deeper into the problem and solve it for themselves if need be, right? And so I have to, that part I have to kind of agree with. There is a grain of truth to it. But I still think that most of the time this, at least from what I can see, it comes down to prestige. It's, I'm sorry to say, it's usually a matter of prestige and labeling people so that you feel more comfortable with your identity. So what I want you to take away from this is that why quite a lot of people will say that web developers are not real engineers is partly true, because if you're not an engineer, if you haven't gone through the education and you're actually an engineer, that's one part of it. The other part is that quite a lot of people have this need to qualify other people if they find themselves to be in a group. And this is not just for engineers or software or anything like that. There are plenty of other professions and quite a lot of self-conscious and insecure people or arrogant people or whatever you want to call them, who really, really want to make sure that anybody who uses their term or the thing that they identify themselves as, that label, then you need to be worthy of that label, because to them, for some reason, it's extremely important. And some people are just, of course, pointing out the fact that there is an ambiguity or an incorrectness in what you're actually saying. And yeah, that's pretty much it, I would say. Have a great day.